Hi everyone, welcome to Module 4. For Module 4, I have various resources for you. You're going to be reading Chapters 7, 8, and 9. I have articles, videos, and teaching summaries as well as the PowerPoint. So make sure to utilize these resources. I think you'll find them very helpful. Let's go over some of the concepts in Chapter 7. It might freeze up on me here. Hold on. In Chapter 7, we're going to focus on this concept of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, let me get to definition. Consumer surplus is the amount a buyer is willing to pay minus the amount a buyer actually pays. So let's say that you go to Panera Bread and you're willing to pay $10 for a sandwich, however you only pay $7. Your consumer surplus would be $3. What you're willing to pay minus what you have to pay. Now let's look at the producer surplus. The producer surplus, I have to find it here. Producer surplus is the amount the seller is willing to do or sell a good or service for minus the actual price that they receive. So I should say it this way. It would be the price that they receive or are paid for minus their cost to produce. So producer surplus is something on the producer side, which is very important to evaluate, compared to consumer surplus, which is looking at individuals and how they make decisions. Now, how do we calculate consumer and producer surplus? So let's look at a graph of this. To calculate consumer surplus, it's the area under the demand curve above the equilibrium price. So anything under the demand curve above the equilibrium price is a consumer surplus. Below the equilibrium price above the supply curve is the producer surplus. So if there's an increase in the price, you'll notice that price increases, consumer surplus decreases, whereas producer surplus will increase. So those are some of the concepts in Chapter 7. Let's go to Chapter 8 now. And let's look at the tax and the effects of a tax. Let me show you the graph here. If we look right here at the graph with a tax, you'll notice the equilibrium price is 200, the quantity produced is 100. Okay? If we want to calculate the consumer surplus, below the demand curve, above the price, that's the area right there, whereas the producer surplus is the area right there. Now let's look at what happens if they put a tax on it. I'm seeing if I can find a better graph for us with a little bit more numbers, but I can't. So let's say the tax is something that's going to be placed on the buyers, but the tax is something that the sellers have to pay and pass it on to consumers. So the supply curve will go right to here. Here will be the new tax, and this is the new supply curve right here. So here's the new equilibrium price. If you draw a line straight down, the difference between these two curves is the amount of the tax. So the consumer surplus is now this area, much smaller. Producer surplus is this area. This is the government revenue that's received, and this is the deadweight loss. You'll see this consistently with these graphs and what they look like with the representation of these areas with the tax. Now let's go to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is going to be dealing with international trade. Let's look at a market, and this is the domestic price, domestic market for international trade. The price in the market's $4 right here. 500 is going to be supplied. If you look at this price of $6, let's say that's the world price in the market. So the U.S. is selling it and producing it at $4. The world price is $6. So at $6, what exists? Supply is greater than demand. If supply is greater than demand, you'll notice a surplus exists, and we will have to export the surplus. because prices are much cheaper than the world price. So we will export that surplus. Now let's look at what happens if the equilibrium price in this example is $3,000 and the world price is $1,500. So at the world price, what exists? 600 people want it, because that's where it hits the demand curve. 200 units are on the shelf. You'll notice that there is going to be a shortage at the world price. Now, the only way to make up for a shortage is if you import. So you'll notice in the US, we struggle to compete. Given that we struggle to compete, we're going to be forcing this where we're going to have to be getting goods from other countries, because we're going to be facing this effect. We're going to have to import. That's what you're looking at with this graph. The effects of the world price to the domestic price, and who gains and who loses from trading. You'll notice that if the US is importing, domestic firms will be at a disadvantage, and that creates a lot of challenges in the market when firms are at a disadvantage. So I do have a lot of resources for you to review. Please let me know if you have any questions as I look forward to your effort.